Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 14th annual G-24 AFI Policymakers Roundtable. Let me also begin this roundtable, as always, by thanking Alfred Hanig and his team in AFI for this wonderful and constructive collaboration over the years. This long-standing partnership between the G-24 and AFI has regularly convened discussion forums among policymakers and international organizations to discuss important and emerging issues related to advancing financial inclusion, particularly in developing countries. Today is yet one more effort to discuss challenges toward ensuring that major and rapidly evolving innovation in digital assets meet their promise of increasing financial inclusion in ways that also ensure stable and orderly financial systems and sectors. Over the last decade, you have all witnessed the major growth of digital assets and their major acceleration in the last few years. Policymakers and international standard setters are confronting important challenges in establishing effective policy and regulatory approaches to manage key sources of macroeconomic and financial sector risks. On the one hand, it is important to be open to the benefits of digital innovation, particularly the potential it holds to enhance the inclusiveness of financial systems. Central banks, for example, point to its ability to significantly enhance the efficiency of cross-border payments. On the other hand, however, there are notable risks to financial stability, integrity, and consumer protection. Going forward, an objective is to strive toward proportionate approaches to realize the benefits of innovation while also containing its risks. Now, I hope that today's discussion will provide good illustrations of how policymakers and regulators are working toward this objective. So before we move on to our first session, which is, I'm really looking forward to it, let me go through a few housekeeping matters now. If you need interpretation, please go to the bottom of the screen, click on the icon and select your desired language. Please raise your hand if you wish to comment or intervene. And when you speak, if it's available to you, please turn on the video. Now, thank you all. So let us get started with a group photo. So please turn on your video and look at the camera and smile. The Secretariat will take a photo. It will take a few seconds, so please bear with us.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Marilo. So if I can have everyone to just turn on your videos. Robin, you can stop the screen sharing. Okay, thank you. So on the count of three, everyone, big smiles. Thank you. One, ready? Okay, 1, 2. We've got more joining in. Just give us. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Just give me a second. And I'm going to do another one. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we'll proceed now to our opening remarks. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jesus de la Fuente Rodriguez, President of Mexico's Comisión Nacional Bancaria de Valores, or CNBV, and Chair of the AFI Board of Directors to provide opening remarks. President de la Fuente, the floor is yours. You might be mute, Dr. de la Fuente.
Yeah. Thank you. Muy buenos días, Marilú Uy, directora de la Secretaría del G24. Alfred Hanig, director ejecutivo de AFI y a todas las personas que participan en esta mesa redonda organizada por la Alianza para la Inclusión Financiera y el Grupo Intergubernamental G-24. Es un honor para mí brindar las palabras de apertura a esta mesa redonda, debido a que en estas reuniones se han impulsado importantes acciones sobre temas de vanguardia, como las finanzas inclusivas con perspectivas de género, la regulación de tecnologías financieras y las finanzas verdes. Este año no es excepción, ya que el tema central sobre la importancia y los riesgos que representan las monedas digitales para la inclusión financiera. Nos encontramos en un hito histórico en el que la tecnología se ha vuelto indispensable y necesaria en el día a día. Ha permeado a todos los aspectos de nuestras vidas y, como es de esperarse, los mecanismos de intercambio de valor se están modificando a la par. La adopción de tecnologías para pagos digitales es una transformación deseable y necesaria para modernizar los sistemas financieros de nuestros países y que estos contribuyan al desarrollo económico y social de sus poblaciones. Por ello, es momento de que los bancos centrales, las autoridades reguladoras y las instituciones encargadas de formular políticas públicas se coordinen para diseñar un entorno para que las monedas digitales se conviertan en un instrumento para reducir las brechas en materia de inclusión financiera. Desde que comenzaron a desarrollarse las monedas digitales, se han citado los posibles beneficios que podrían tener para la inclusión financiera, especialmente de las personas en situación de vulnerabilidad. Las monedas digitales, particularmente las públicas, tienen el potencial de contribuir a minorar algunas de las barreras que resultan en la exclusión financiera, como pueden ser la imposibilidad de hacer pagos o transferencias de dinero de una forma rápida y segura, los altos costos de operación y el uso de servicios financieros o la falta de documentación necesaria para acceder a los servicios tradicionales. Más aún, a partir de estas monedas digitales, podría crearse un sistema de pagos doméstico y transfronterizo caracterizado por su rapidez, eficiencia y bajas comisiones en beneficio de las familias y las personas migrantes o desplazadas. Esta transformación puede llegar a la digitalización de toda la cadena productiva, incluyendo a las pequeñas y medianas empresas, lo que podría ser especialmente revolucionario en los países cuyo sistema financiero digital está en conformación. Ante la promesa que representan las monedas digitales, habría también que mostrar cautela sobre el alcance que pudieran tener con respecto a la inclusión financiera, ya que como gobiernos tenemos la responsabilidad de identificar y abordar las causas más profundas de exclusión que no son posibles resolver por esta vía. Estas causas están mayormente ligadas a la falta de oportunidades, la limitación de recursos económicos, así como a formas de discriminación y marginación que afectan especialmente a algunos de estos grupos en el mundo digital. Por ello, es importante un mayor entendimiento de las necesidades financieras de los sectores excluidos o parcialmente incluidos, que podrían atenderse por medio de las monedas digitales al crear condiciones de acceso universal. Regularmente nos encontramos ante el reto de adaptar el enfoque tradicional hacia la prevención de actividades ilícitas, principalmente el lavado de dinero y el combate al terrorismo en el ámbito de las monedas digitales. El impacto puede estar en el uso que les den a las personas usuarias a estas tecnologías. Por ejemplo, que exista la capacidad de transferir valor de manera anónima puede ser de utilidad para las personas migrantes o desplazadas, pues en muchas ocasiones carecen de medios de identificación. Sin embargo, esta misma virtud de las criptomonedas puede ser incentivar el uso de esta tecnología para financiar a grupos delictivos o para el lavado del dinero. La volatilidad en los precios de cualquier producto es un riesgo para las personas que lo consumen. Esta característica está presente en la mayoría de los activos virtuales, principalmente por la falta de una referencia clara para obtener una estimación de su precio. Otro riesgo para las personas usuarias es la asimetría de información por la complejidad de los procesos matemáticos y criptográficos que soportan los activos virtuales. Por su parte, los bancos centrales, al emitir monedas digitales, mitigarán en gran medida estos riesgos al incorporar la provisión de estos medios de pago entre sus mecanismos para proveer al público de moneda de curso legal. No obstante, es importante que la emisión de una moneda digital por parte de las autoridades monetarias se realice de tal forma que se evite la centralización de los servicios de pago, aspectos por los cuales seguramente en la mesa del día de hoy se arrojará mayor entendimiento. Los ejemplos antes descritos nos muestran que las características de una tecnología en el sistema financiero pueden ser benéficas para los sectores desatendidos de la población y por el lado contrario, Estas mismas características pueden significar un riesgo tanto para las personas usuarias como para el sistema financiero en su conjunto. Por lo anterior, es importante que los países cuenten con una regulación adecuada para las instituciones que desarrollan o utilizan tecnología financiera. Me permito compartir que México ha sido desde hace muchos años pionero ha sido pionero en temas de modernización del sistema financiero. Banco de México implementó hace más de 15 años un sistema de pagos interbancario en tiempo real, sin límites en el número o en el monto de transacciones y a muy bajo precio. En 2018 se aprobó la ley para regular las instituciones de tecnología financiera, también conocida como ley FinTech. Con esta ley, nuestro país empezó a regular a las instituciones de fondos de pago electrónicos, a las instituciones de fondeo colectivo, a las interfaces de programación de aplicaciones para intercambio de información entre entidades financieras y los activos virtuales. Recientemente, el Banco de México anunció que está trabajando para que avancemos hacia una moneda digital pública que funja como la representación electrónica del peso mexicano. Esto es, sin la volatilidad que presentan algunas monedas digitales privadas. Pasos, sin duda alguna, significativos que, realizados de manera gradual y prudente, buscamos nos permitan ir explorando y en su momento aprovechar las ventajas que esta tecnología puede tener en beneficio de la inclusión financiera de nuestra población. Por todo lo anterior, espero que en las sesiones que se llevarán a cabo este día se ofrezca un panorama más detallado sobre las monedas digitales privadas y su regulación, con la finalidad de compartir la identificación de oportunidades y riesgos, así como el surgimiento y desafíos que enfrentan las monedas digitales públicas, al igual que su potencial para acelerar la inclusión financiera de las personas históricamente excluidas. Les deseo un fructífero y exitoso día de trabajo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. de la Fuente, and thank you for your opening remarks and for sharing the strong efforts of Mexico to foster and enhance financial inclusion. So at this point, we'll now proceed to our first session. And today, at this session, we will deal with the policy and regulatory approaches and the challenges arising from private digital assets. We will start the session with an overview of the evolving landscape of digital assets and currencies. And for this, Professor Douglas Arner of the University of Hong Kong has kindly agreed to join us. We are indeed very pleased to welcome you back, Professor Arner, to our roundtable. Professor Arner will highlight the top-of-the-mind priorities that policymakers and regulators are considering and addressing in this emerging area. So, Professor Arner, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mary Lou, and great to see you again, and also to see a number of other friends. It's great to be back, and I think that this is a topic that we're all spending an increasing amount on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin, and I'm going to share a few slides to give a little bit of structure. Essentially, I want to talk about this range. Cryptocurrencies, global stablecoins, central bank digital currencies. And I think I think Dr. Rodriguez's presentation very much highlighted exactly this sort of range of issues and the challenges in evolution. And I want to try to generalize a little bit about that experience. And I think the starting point is that when we are talking about money, finance, payment, that they are co-developmental with technology. That if we look back over the past 4,000 years of human civilization, we'll see a parallel development moving from stone tablets to minted coins to paper money to bills, checks, the telegraph, electronic payment systems like real-time gross settlement systems, mobile money systems, fast payment systems, cryptocurrencies, global stablecoins, and central bank digital currencies. That's 4,000 years of technological evolution in money and payment. And I think that when we think about the last, really we can think from the early 1970s when we see the establishment of the SWIFT system internationally, the development across the 1980s and 1990s of real-time gross settlement systems, the expansion of these two fast payment systems and blockchain and decentralized systems. Basically, over the past 30, 40 years, we've had a technological revolution in money and payment systems. And we need to look at this both from the standpoint of decentralized systems like blockchain, though, as well as centralized systems. And when we are thinking about digital money, digital payment, we have to think about both of these things together. And what I often highlight is this idea that I think Dr. Rodriguez highlighted very well, that we are often looking at a certain technological horizon and whatever technologies we have and the way that those can be used in the context of the financial sector. And I think from the standpoint of financial inclusion, sustainable development, it's a very exciting time because we have a range of technological options which allow us to do things differently and in many cases better than we've done them before. But at the same time, from a policy and a regulatory standpoint, it's also a challenge because it means that all of us are having to come to terms with new technologies, new instruments, new players, which we haven't done in the past, and that things are often moving very, very rapidly. Now, from the standpoint of central banks, really a starting point when we think about central banks is central banks, the area of technology where central banks are most comfortable is in the context of payment systems. This is the area where we have worked with electronic payments, really dating back to the telegraph over 150 years ago. Teams in central banks around the world have responsibilities for large value payment systems because it's really the payment system that brings together our core central bank objectives of monetary stability, financial stability, and broader sustainable development. And it's the payment system that brings money, finance, and development all together. And as a result, a key focus of central banks over the past century and a half has always been the payment system and the application of new technologies in the context of the monetary system and the payment system. And so we can think about the past 40 years of looking at centralized systems like RTGS systems. More recently, over the past decade and a half, mobile money systems, and in the past 5-7 years, fast payment systems. Parallel to that, dating back to 2009, we see the launch of Bitcoin as the first cryptocurrency and the first blockchain application. And it has to be said that Bitcoin today is probably one of the few truly successful decentralized blockchain systems. And I think that makes it interesting in and of itself. We've seen the emergence of stablecoins from around 2013. And this is somewhat ironic when you think about it, because of course, the original rationale behind Bitcoin was to be a technological alternative to sovereign fiat currencies and some of the excesses which had been illustrated so clearly in the context of the 2008 global financial crisis. But by 2013, we're already seeing the advent of the first stable coins, basically digital currencies which seek to tie the value of a digital asset in a blockchain environment to the value of a fiat currency. And many central banks began looking at Bitcoin in particular from the standpoint of, was it really a credible challenger from about a decade ago? And I think that most central banks concluded that it wasn't really a credible challenger, though we are seeing an increasing range of jurisdictions which are seeing it used more and more widely, including, as the following speaker will discuss, intentionally as well as unintentionally. We see central banks then turning, as much of the financial sector, to looking at the applications of blockchain and its potential impact. We then see this consideration of stablecoins, but I think it's only in 2019 with an announcement by Facebook of its intention to create its own private cryptocurrency, initially called Libra, which in all likelihood is never going to come into existence, but nonetheless is going to be a very important milestone in the evolution of monetary history. Libra was the proposal for the first global stable coin, a digital currency created by a global private sector tech company, which could have been a credible threat, not only to currencies in developing countries and emerging markets, but even to developed countries and major economies. And I think the reaction to that came very clearly just a few months later with the announcement by the People's Bank of China in October of 2019 of its intention to begin a launch of full-scale pilots of what was initially called DCEP, the Digital Currency Electronic Payment System, now more widely called the Digital Yuan or the ECNY. And the ECNY, which is now in national pilot transactions with an expectation of full rollout probably in 2023, when, not if, it's now a when it launches, will be the world's first major currency central bank digital currency. And it's something where the ECNY was designed very much with domestic objectives in mind, but particularly in the context of the use of digital finance in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. We are seeing countries all across the world thinking increasingly about the roles of their own central bank digital currencies, their own electronic payment systems, which was something that in the context of COVID had already been taking place. Now, from the standpoint of regulation, we've also seen, as Dr. Rodriguez, I think, has very well highlighted, if we look at those early years from 2008 to 2013, we can see a pretty limited population, basically made up of what I characterize as enthusiasts, tech enthusiasts, gamers, a few others, and criminals. We see early use of cryptocurrencies, particularly in the context of the dark web and a range of criminal activity. And so we see an early focus from the standpoint of cryptocurrencies, from the standpoint of market integrity, money laundering, criminal use of the financial system. And we can say that from the standpoint of many law enforcement agencies, having now over a decade of experience with cryptocurrencies, many law enforcement agencies have become increasingly comfortable with Bitcoin in particular as a very useful tool actually to be able to track criminal networks and payments, and therefore something that they look at in a quite different way than they did at the time. Now, from 2013 to about 2016, we see the first global stablecoins, well, the first stablecoins, not global stablecoins. We see a broadening of use, and we see the creation of Ethereum, of Tether, of the first major exchange, Mt. Gox. And it's in this period that we see the failure of that exchange, highlighting real issues around consumer and investor protection. In other words, the Mt. Gox insolvency highlighted that effectively in the context of digital assets, there was very limited segregation of assets. There were very limited cybersecurity controls, very limited disclosure. And as a result, from the standpoint of consumers and potential investors, big risks. We see a major broadening of the market in 2016, 2018, with what we call the ICO bubble, initial coin offerings. And at this point, we see a real focus of securities regulators. But throughout this period, that first decade, we see kind of a range. Many central banks taking quite hard approaches, banning cryptocurrencies, but we also see quite a lot of central banks and regulators taking more facilitative approaches, the view being that this is a new technology, a new instrument, and that it had not had such a broad reach that we had real financial stability concerns. But I think that launch of Libra in 2019 highlighted the first time the risk of real financial stability issues. And Libra brought with it a major response in the context of international action to regulate stablecoins. In addition, we've seen processes to try to normalize digital assets from the standpoint of regulation, bringing them into the normal regulatory system. I think this slowed down in 2021 as a result of a high level of volatility in markets, the emergence of gamification, and the broadening of markets much further than we've seen before. And I kind of marked this when in November of 2021, my 75-year-old mother asked me on behalf of her friends whether they should be investing in cryptocurrencies. And I think at that stage, that's usually a signal to most of us when 75-year-old grandmothers began asking us about the viability of a speculative investment, that probably that market has become quite broad and we need to think about some of the potential systemic concerns. And I think as we think about COVID, these things have come together, not only from the standpoint of payments, but also from a very large number of central bank digital currency projects seeking to address a range of different central bank objectives and functions. I think what we can see is that from the standpoint of different jurisdictions, different types of approaches. Developing markets often looking to support financial inclusion, to address problems where monetary and payment systems are not well functioning. In the context of emerging markets, often looking to mobilize and support development and innovation in finance. From the standpoint of developed markets, often looking to address the fact that economies, financial systems are moving towards a cashless situation in any event. And finally, from the standpoint of major economies, I think an increasing geopolitical competition that is likely to accelerate in coming years. And when we put all of these pieces together, we're seeing a range of different combinations. China, a central bank digital currency, a national strategy to develop blockchain, a ban on cryptocurrencies and other digital assets, with a legal framework to tie all of these things together. At one extreme, and a range of other approaches, all the way to Switzerland, which has developed comprehensive legislation, both to address risks, but also to support market development. I think the final piece is that Libra, while most of us didn't really buy Facebook's initial argument about it being focused on financial inclusion and addressing remittance issues, what Libra highlighted to, I think, all of us is that the technology exists to build better monetary and financial systems, and that we should be using that technology domestically and in the context of the G20 roadmap internationally to build better systems. So, just a quick tour, I think, of the evolution of technology, money, payment, and the different regulatory challenges as well as approaches. Back to you, Mary Lou. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Arner, for that very comprehensive introduction to our session. Our next speaker, I'd like to welcome Mr. Douglas Rodriguez, President of the Central Bank of El Salvador. President Rodriguez, El Salvador has welcomed digital currency innovation as a contributor to enhancing growth and prosperity. It will be very useful for all of us here if you could share with us El Salvador's experience in terms of the benefits you have seen from digital currency adoption, and how the central bank is managing the risks to financial integrity and stability. So President Rodriguez, the floor is yours.
Muy buenos días a todos. Claro, con mucho gusto. Es muy grato para mí compartir con ustedes en esta mesa sobre los enfoques de políticas y regulación para las monedas digitales privadas. Alineación de los objetivos de la inclusión, integridad y estabilidad, así como compartir la perspectiva de El Salvador en este tema. En El Salvador, la inclusión financiera es un objeto primordial para nuestro gobierno, y a partir de los resultados de la encuesta nacional de acceso y uso de servicios financieros realizada en el 2016 por esta entidad, con el apoyo de AFI, se observó que el país presentaba importantes retos para fortalecer la inclusión financiera, ya que la encuesta indicó que solamente un 23% de la población cuenta con una cuenta o acceso a los servicios tradicionales financieros. Sin embargo, las transferencias por medio de teléfono celular reflejaron una participación igual entre hombres y mujeres, la cual representa que el uso de la tecnología es una herramienta muy importante para propiciar la inclusión financiera de la población salvadoreña. En este sentido, el país ha dado pasos importantísimos para proveer la inclusión financiera, entre los que puedo mencionar la aprobación de la Ley para Facilitación de la Inclusión Financiera, que se aprobó en el 2015, mediante la cual se crearon las cuentas de ahorro con requisitos simplificados y las del dinero electrónico. También en el 2019 se creó el Consejo Nacional de Inclusión y Educación Financiera, que es coordinado por el Banco Central de Reserva, y la Política Nacional de Inclusión Financiera, que fue aprobada por el presidente de la República, Nayib Bukele, en marzo del 2021. y en la que se establecen como pilares facilitar y ampliar el acceso de productos financieros a través de la digitalización e innovación financiera. Adicionalmente, en el mes de septiembre del 2021 y como una política pública para un mayor impulso de la inclusión financiera en el país, entró en vigencia la ley Bitcoin, mediante la cual se estableció al Bitcoin como una moneda de curso legal en El Salvador y se creó una billetera digital denominada Chivo, con el objetivo de facilitar a la población salvadoreña el manejo de dólares o Bitcoin a través de un teléfono celular, incentivando las transferencias, pagos y remesas familiares. Con el objeto de garantizar su aplicación y que la misma sea acorde a las buenas prácticas internacionales, se emitió el reglamento de la ley Bitcoin, aprobado por el presidente de la República, que establece, entre otras cosas, las obligaciones de carácter general para todos los proveedores de servicios Bitcoin, tales como las disposiciones para el registro en el Banco Central de Reserva, el cumplimiento de normas de conducta, la supervisión por parte de la Superintendencia del Sistema Financiero, aspectos referentes a la prevención del lavado de dinero y activos que cumpla con el marco legal en materia y las mejores prácticas internacionales articuladas por el Grupo de Acción Financiera Internacional o por sus siglas GAFI. También salvaguarda de activos e intereses de los clientes, registro de obligaciones, procesos para atender reclamos, programas de debida diligencia, entre otros, que los proveedores de servicios Bitcoin deben tomar en cuenta en sus operaciones. Como Banco Central, el regulador del sistema financiero, mediante su comité de normas, se emitió la normativa técnica correspondiente para establecer las disposiciones relacionadas a la contratación de proveedores de servicios Bitcoin con entidades del sistema financiero. Y a través de su consejo directivo se emitieron los lineamientos para la autorización del funcionamiento de las plataformas tecnológicas de los servicios Bitcoin y dólares que deseen proveer las entidades financieras a sus clientes. A la fecha, se ha autorizado a 2 bancos del sistema financiero, una sociedad de ahorro y crédito y un proveedor de dinero electrónico. El funcionamiento de sus plataformas tecnológicas a fin de poder recibir pagos en Bitcoin de acuerdo a sus nuevos modelos de negocio innovadores, permitiendo que más personas puedan acceder a este tipo de servicios. En cuanto a la ciberseguridad, junto a las normas técnicas de continuidad del negocio y seguridad de la información, se han aprobado las normas técnicas sobre medidas de ciberseguridad en canales digitales, captadores de depósitos y las normas técnicas para la gestión de seguridad de la información. A un poco más de 6 meses de la implementación del Bitcoin en El Salvador, se pueden mencionar ventajas como las siguientes. El uso global del mismo, ya que se puede ser utilizado en todo el mundo independientemente de las barreras geográficas. Además, se ha observado que es un medio de pago ampliamente utilizado en farmacias, supermercados, comidas rápidas, telecomunicaciones, turismo, restaurantes, bancos y pequeños emprendimientos, entre otros. Además, que es una moneda divisible que tiene como referencia su equivalente en dólares. Las transacciones son realizadas en tiempo real y son fácilmente trazables, brindando con ello seguridad a los usuarios de las transacciones, una optimización de los procesos de pago a partir de la reducción de costos en comparación a otras operaciones tradicionales del sistema financiero. Además, brinda una alternativa de inversión, esto especialmente para la población que conoce el mercado de las criptomonedas, tomando en cuenta que el Bitcoin es una criptomoneda con mayor nivel de capitalización y utilización a nivel mundial, y también que se ha despertado el interés de inversionistas para conocer el país, lo cual también propicia nuevas oportunidades de negocio que pueden ser aprovechadas y contribuir así al crecimiento económico de El Salvador. En el país, la experiencia Bitcoin como medio de pago nace con la experiencia que se observó en una playa denominada El Zonte, que está en el departamento de La Libertad, como un medio de pago, lo cual propició una mayor inclusión y atracción del turismo en esa zona, representando un mecanismo idóneo y efectivo para llevar a cabo las actividades comerciales, generando empleos e ingresos para todos los habitantes de esa playa, El Zonte. Es así que el uso del Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal y la creación de la billetera digital Chivo Wallet como plataforma gratuita y de acceso libre a los salvadoreños constituyen un instrumento para la inclusión financiera de la población salvadoreña y brinda un medio de pago fácil y seguro tanto para las personas naturales y jurídicas, dado que el número de billeteras Chivo con operaciones de recargas en el mes han representado para marzo del 2022 más de 1 millón de operaciones. Asimismo, su implementación ha contribuido al dinamismo del turismo extranjero, recibiéndose muchos más turistas en el país en comparación de años anteriores. Además, desde septiembre del 2021 a marzo de este año, se han recibido remesas familiares a través de la billetera Chivo Wallet por un monto de $86 millones, reflejándose con ello el gradual proceso de adopción del Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal en El Salvador. El Bitcoin es además la base de una estrategia para promover la inclusión financiera de las micro y las pequeñas empresas en el país. Según la encuesta de utilización de Bitcoin por parte de las MIPES en sus actividades comerciales realizada por la Comisión Nacional de la Micro y Pequeña Empresa, CONAMIPE por sus siglas, entre el 21 de octubre al 14 de noviembre del 2021, el 72% de las MIPES encuestadas utiliza el Bitcoin, beneficiando principalmente a las clasificadas como emprendimientos con un 49%. Junto a la implementación del Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal, el sistema financiero continúa estable y resiliente, mostrando buenas condiciones de liquidez, solvencia y rentabilidad según nuestros informes de estabilidad financiera más recientes. Con la aprobación de la ley Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal y los efectos de la pandemia, se ha dado un impulso a la economía digital y el uso de las nuevas tecnologías, lo cual permitirá el mayor desarrollo del sistema financiero, provocando importantes desafíos para las autoridades en regulación de los servicios financieros digitales. La supervisión basada en riesgos y la modernización de los sistemas de pago mayoristas y minoristas. Consciente de esos desafíos, como Banco Central, en cooperación con las instituciones que están trabajando en una estrategia nacional FinTech que permita aprovechar el impulso de la ley Bitcoin para acceder y acelerar la adopción de las innovaciones financieras y la digitalización de la economía. Las FinTech y el Bitcoin como punta de lanza abren una ventana de oportunidad tecnológica para el país y estas pueden apalancar la expansión y el desarrollo de la economía digital y con ello el aumento de su aporte al crecimiento económico. Les agradezco la oportunidad de compartir nuestra visión en esta mesa técnica de enfoque de políticas y normativas para las monedas digitales privadas, alineación de los objetivos de la inclusión e integridad y estabilidad. Les agradezco muchísimo y que pasen un feliz día a todos. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez, for sharing El Salvador's very interesting experience. So, colleagues, let me now turn to our third speaker and final speaker for this session. It is a great pleasure to welcome Rupert Thorne, who's Deputy Secretary General of the Financial Stability Board. Rupert, the G20 has asked the FSB to look at the risks to financial stability emanating from crypto assets. And I understand you produced a report, an update in February this year. Could you share with us the main findings of the FSB and what would you like to share with, what advice would you like to share with our G24 and AFI members? So Rupert, it's really wonderful that you could join us today. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone today. So the FSB's work on financial technology aims to harness the benefits of digital innovation while containing their risks. And this work covers a wide variety of FinTech activities. And I'm going to focus my remarks, though, on two related areas here, crypto assets and cross-border payments more broadly. And as you say, work on crypto assets has moved up the FSB's priority list this year. The FSB announced a heightened level of concern in February when we published the updated assessment of risks that you mentioned. It's available on our website. We warned there that crypto asset markets are fast evolving and could reach a point where they represent a threat to global financial stability due to their scale, their structural vulnerabilities, and the increasing connectedness with the traditional financial system. And this underscores the need for timely and preemptive policy responses, not just to address financial stability risks, but also, as Professor Anna mentioned, misuse of crypto assets for money laundering and other criminal purposes. We're conscious that crypto asset use is quite prevalent in some emerging markets. We had an excellent example here from El Salvador, and could in principle assist with financial inclusion. However, it's less clear to what extent the current users of crypto assets are in practice those who were previously financially excluded when one looks across emerging markets. And a wide use of such assets may present particular financial stability risks in emerging markets, for instance, as an additional channel for capital outflows. So it's important that this sector be properly regulated if it's to be able to support stable and sustainable financial inclusion. The FSB's work is now examining crypto asset markets in 3 areas: stable coins, unbacked crypto assets such as Bitcoin, and decentralized finance more broadly, or DeFi as it's sometimes called. Our goal in these work streams is to achieve global convergence around regulatory approaches to avoid arbitrage and fragmentation, and to promote greater certainty and clarity around the rules. Regarding stablecoins, the FSB issued a set of high-level recommendations in October 2020, and we're now examining, in close cooperation with the standard-setting bodies, whether there are any gaps in sectoral standards or in those high-level recommendations and how these could be addressed. As regards unbacked crypto assets, we've started a new work stream this year following our report that will consider whether these assets and the wider ecosystem, including instruments, issuers, and infrastructures around them, are appropriately captured by existing regulatory regimes. And here too, we intend to identify potential regulatory and supervisory gaps and challenges, and assess potential regulatory and supervisory responses. The presumption for the regulation and supervision both of stablecoins and other crypto assets is that sectoral standards should apply based on the principle same business, same risk, same rules. And this means in this case that crypto assets should be subject to standards that are aligned with those imposed on any entity performing the same set of economic functions. However, we're aware that sectoral standards were not designed with crypto assets in mind, and some adaptation may be necessary to capture their specificities. So, for example, should crypto assets be treated according to the same standards as deposits, as securities, as money market funds, or something else? Questions like these are challenging ones, not least given the diversity and constantly evolving nature of crypto assets. One can't just fit them all in one bucket. Finally, on decentralized finance, the challenge is to fit this activity within existing regulatory approaches as well. As financial regulators, we rely on identifying responsible institutions and then subjecting them to the regulation, supervision, and law enforcement. So how can we adapt to a world where the nature of institutional presence is being redefined? The FSB will be preparing a report in the second half of this year on developments and potential risks to financial stability concerning broader decentralized finance, and consider whether to develop policy approaches here to it as well. So I've spoken a lot about the risks of crypto assets, reflecting the topic of this agenda item. To be clear, the objective of our work is not to curb innovation and new ideas, but rather to create conditions for safe innovation. And in that note, I'd just like to say a word about opportunities to improve the payment system more broadly. As Professor Anna noted, we published a roadmap in 2020, which has been endorsed by the G20, to make cross-border payments faster, cheaper, more transparent, and more inclusive. And it covers all types of payments, wholesale, retail, and remittances. It doesn't just focus on one type of technology. Instead, it contains a wide range of measures, both to improve existing payment infrastructures and arrangements, and to explore new types of technologies, including both stablecoins and central bank digital currencies. In order to focus the work of the roadmap on tangible improvements for those sending and receiving payments, we've set quantitative targets for improvements in the 4 areas of challenge that I just mentioned: cost, speed, transparency, and inclusion. And I'd like to draw attention to a target particularly relevant to financial inclusion, namely that all end users, whether they are individuals, businesses, including SMEs or banks, should have at least one option for sending or receiving cross-border electronic payments by end 2027, i.e. at least one infrastructure or provider available. This is a target we're working to achieve without compromising on safety and soundness standards or AML CFT rules, and without backing one particular technology horse in the race to achieve this. So I'd just like to end by reminding that the vast majority of the work in our roadmap is about enhancing existing payment systems, which we shouldn't forget, while also taking steps to explore the exciting possibilities of digital currencies, both private and public. Thanks very much, Mary Lou.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for providing the very important perspective of an international standard setter. I believe you will have a lot of work to do in this area, this very complex area. Well, thank you very much for that. So let me now move on to, let me open the floor now for some comments or, and questions from the audience. There's one specific question to El Salvador, which is what's the share of Bitcoin transactions in terms of total financial transactions from the time El Salvador Central Bank accepted Bitcoin as legal tender? And how is the trend on this? Did the pandemic accelerate adoption in any way? So let me turn to President Rodriguez for this. President Rodriguez, are you connected? Thank you.
Sí.
Gracias.
Claro que sí. La exposición actualmente es poca comparado con las operaciones en dólares. Cerca del 98% de las operaciones en El Salvador siguen siendo en dólares. Ya lo mencionamos, tenemos alrededor de 6 meses de haber implementado el Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal y actualmente estamos en proceso de desarrollo. Ha tenido una gran aceptación. De hecho, las operaciones a marzo del 2022 son más de 1 millón de operaciones las que se han realizado y tenemos alrededor de 4 millones de usuarios activos de la billetera Chivo Wallet. Y las transacciones obviamente siguen alrededor de 88,000 transacciones o operaciones a través del archivo wallet por parte mensuales, ¿verdad? Por parte de todos los usuarios del archivo wallet. La remesas.
Dr. Rodriguez, I'm sorry, there's another question. This is any consideration for interest being paid on the Chivo wallet?
No, el archivo wallet por ley no tiene ningún costo, no tiene tampoco ninguna operación, no tiene ningún costo de operación para los usuarios. Absolutamente no existe ni comisión por convertibilidad, ni tampoco por uso, ni tampoco ningún tipo de interés proveído por parte del archivo wallet. Simplemente es un medio poderoso de inclusión financiera, una herramienta que se ha utilizado como una política pública para poder llegar a ese 77% que está excluido en El Salvador de los servicios financieros tradicionales. Pero por ley no tiene ningún costo para la población. Ningún tipo de operación tiene costo. Y precisamente esa es la versatilidad que tiene el archivo wallet, que se pueden mandar remesas donde regularmente el proveedor de las remesas, no voy a mencionar nombres porque tampoco puedo hacer eso, cobra alrededor del 10% al 15% de comisión por mandar una remesa de Estados Unidos, que es el mayor proveedor de remesas a El Salvador. Cobra el 15% al 10% de comisión por mandar la remesa a través del archivo wallet. Es completamente gratis. el envío de remesas, y eso significa para El Salvador un crecimiento en la economía, ya que la familia, en vez de pagar la comisión, lo envía directamente a través del archivo wallet a la familia de El Salvador, y lo que significa un mayor consumo privado, y eso obviamente activa las cadenas de suministros y también las demás actividades económicas y nos ayuda al crecimiento económico del país.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodriguez, Mr. Rodriguez. Let me, I have a raised hand from Hideaki Matsume from FSA in Japan. So Hideaki, the floor is yours. And then I will turn to two other questions that have been raised on chat. So Hideaki, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening from Japan. I'm Hideaki Matsumae, Deputy Director of International Office of the Financial Services Agency. I take part in the meetings of GPFI, Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, for which AFI is an implementing partner. So I'm really honored to have an opportunity to speak here, just very briefly about Japan's experience. So the Japanese government is constantly watching the latest situations of crypto asset related businesses. And putting this in an international context, I point out that the work of Financial Action Task Force on money laundering, so-called FATF, some of the presentation mentioned earlier. So FATF finalized and released global standards for crypto assets in June 2019. And FATF has been urging countries to introduce national regulations in line with FATF standards. So in Japan, ahead of the launch of the FATF standards, Japan started its regulation for crypto asset service providers by requiring them to register themselves in 2017. I mean, the registration to the Financial Services Agency. So crypto assets have high affinity for financial inclusion. So Japan has been working on more effective management of crypto assets businesses to take a good balance between customers' convenience and protection and innovation, as other speakers said. So for example, while the Japanese government is conducting the processing of registration requests by potential service providers in a transparent manner, but also at the same time, the government, the Financial Service Agency, responds to unregistered service providers rigorously to address the risks by such unregulated service providers. So finally, just let me mention that Japan is a co-chair of the FATF Virtual Asset Contact Group of the FATF, along with the United States. So Japan will continue to play key role, active role in the FATF work regarding crypto assets, and also wider context of the regulation of crypto assets. I'm not sure whether Japan's experience is, to what extent it's relevant to AFI G-24 members, but yeah, thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Hideaki. Clearly, it's something that our members would like to listen to, given the strong interest in the development of at least central bank digital currencies and managing private crypto assets. So I'll turn now to our speakers before closing the session. But before that, let me just say that there are a few questions on chat that perhaps some of you could address, which is whether CBDCs, could be a threat to popular payment options, which probably the second session will touch on. And then El Salvador, how you manage the volatility of the value of Bitcoin, and whether its banks could capture deposits, a la vista or plazo in Bitcoin. And then how can the risks of digital money and payment be managed? So, and what kind of level of financial education might be necessary in the use of private assets such as Bitcoin. And then, of course, it could be a competitive, a CBDC, again, for the second session, if I could just defer to Alfred on that, on the CBDC. So then for developing countries, it would be interesting to know how much additional energy resources result in the use of Bitcoin, and can the president of the Central Bank of El Salvador tell us more about this? And has El Salvador looked at other digital currencies to complement their acceptance of Bitcoin, which is an interesting question. So let me now turn to our speakers. Perhaps I could start with, in the order that they spoke, Professor Arner, and then we'll go to Mr. Rodriguez, and then Rupert. So Douglas, Professor Arner, the floor is yours. Very briefly.
Thanks for that, Beilu. And I've actually taken the opportunity to answer a couple of the questions in the chat. So what I'm actually going to do, because I think many of the questions were focused on Governor Rodrigo Fuentes, is actually pass my time to him for those questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez.
Ok, vamos a empezar por las primeras, las que escribieron. Bueno, ¿cómo manejamos la volatilidad del Bitcoin? Bueno, es precisamente con una convertibilidad inmediata. El usuario que quiere tener Bitcoin y los quiere poseer, simplemente los tiene a través de su Chivo Wallet, porque la Chivo Wallet tiene el mecanismo de conversión inmediata entre dólares y Bitcoin. Si alguien no quiere tener volatilidad y recibe un pago en Bitcoin, automáticamente lo convierte a dólares y él ya no tiene la volatilidad. Pero si en cambio él quiere experimentar la experiencia de tener Bitcoin y poder ganar, porque la volatilidad no es solamente para perder, la volatilidad también funciona hacia ganar. Entonces, si alguien quiere experimentarlo, puede tener en Bitcoin en su Chivo Wallet y convertirlo a dólares cuando él quiera. La convertibilidad es una gran herramienta que tiene, una gran aplicación que tiene la Chivo Wallet dentro de sus funciones y es bastante utilizada por las personas, tanto que no quieren tener Bitcoin como las personas que quieren tener Bitcoin. Voy a pasar a la siguiente, yo sé que el tiempo es corto. Los bancos pueden captar depósitos a la vista. Por el momento, ningún banco tiene posiciones en sus activos o en sus pasivos de depósitos. Pueden tenerlos, sí, pero ningún banco está mostrado el interés de tenerlos. Y además se necesita una autorización del Banco Central de Reserva para poder autorizarle a un banco que reciba ese tipo de depósitos a la vista en Bitcoin. ¿Cómo estamos atacando la brecha digital de educación financiera? Bueno, el Banco Central de Reserva, como coordinador del Consejo Nacional de Inclusión Financiera a través de la Política Nacional de Inclusión y Educación Financiera, lanzó un sitio que es de acceso gratuito y sin consumo de Internet, de planes de datos de Internet para la población, ya denominado el sitio de educación financiera, donde damos cursos completamente gratuitos con videos y también cursos interactivos del uso de las criptomonedas y del Bitcoin en específico en El Salvador, y también pueden tomarse unos cursos que pueden ser largos o pueden ser medianos o cortos sobre el uso de las criptomonedas y todo lo relacionado a las criptomonedas. De esa manera la población está educada. Y también tenemos asistencia inmediata. Si alguien tiene una consulta o tiene una pregunta, la puede hacer inmediatamente y se la respondemos. Vamos a ver otra pregunta.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm sorry. Okay, let me now turn to Rupert for his final remarks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just very briefly. So I saw the question, the very broad yet challenging question in the chat. How can the risks of digital money and payment be mitigated? So very complex question. The key thing I'd like to stress is that these instruments are inherently global in nature, and therefore international standards and international cooperation are key. and also across sectors as well, because the risks come in many different sorts and they fall in different responsibilities. Volatility, investor protection. These are the sorts of things that fall within the realm of securities regulators potentially. Money laundering risks, FATF, we heard from our JFSA colleague there. Payments, the risks of arising from payment systems, ensuring they're sound. This is responsibility in the area of CPMI, and interconnections with traditional banking system obviously fall within the Basel Committee's remit. So a very wide range of international standard setters need to coordinate and ensure consistency, and there are not gaps in managing the risks. So just to make those points there. Thanks very much.
Okay, President Rodriguez, the final word is yours. President.
Sí, voy a responder a otras preguntas que están en el chat. Bueno, si estamos interesados en implementar otro tipo de monedas o criptomonedas, por el momento no. Pueden funcionar dentro de El Salvador, como pueden funcionar en cualquier parte del mundo, otro tipo de monedas. Vamos a mencionar Ethereum, Cardano, Tether, entre otras. Pueden funcionar en El Salvador, pero no son consideradas como moneda de curso legal. Actualmente solamente el Bitcoin se ha considerado como moneda de curso legal y no hay planes también para poder implementar otro tipo de monedas como curso legal. Sobre la energía, el costo de la energía, nosotros tenemos una planta generadora de energía a través de geotermia. Es a través de vapor que funciona, que es natural, es una fuente de generación de energía natural a través de geotermia, y eso nos ayuda a abaratar también el costo de la energía para poder hacer el minado de Bitcoin. El Salvador también va a lanzar un bono volcán de $1.000 millones que se va a pagar también con minería. Se va a pagar en dólares y será en dólares, pero se va a utilizar la minería para poder pagar ese bono volcán. Hasta aquí mi intervención. Espero haya sido de utilidad y que tengan un feliz día a todos.
Thank you very much, President Rodriguez. There is one raised hand, and if I could give you a very brief, if you could provide a very brief intervention, Mohammed Lamin.
Merci, Madame. C'est Mohamed Lamine Conte, le premier vice-gouverneur de la Banque centrale de la République de Guinée. Je voudrais juste poser une question à Salvador. C'était, comme on le sait, que l'utilisation des bitcoins requiert un niveau d'éducation financière concilier ce défi d'éducation financière avec l'utilisation des bitcoins pour atteindre ainsi l'objectif d'inclusion financière. Merci.
Thank you. We're kind of running out of time, but President Rodriguez, if you have a brief comment. I think you're on mute.
Sí, claro. Gracias, Marilu. En el sentido de la educación financiera, sí reconocemos que educar a 4 millones de personas en un tan corto tiempo es un gran reto, pero por eso a través del Consejo Nacional de Inclusión Financiera se determinó un sitio especializado donde cualquier salvadoreño o no importa dónde, en qué parte del mundo esté, puede acceder a videos y a cursos interactivos para poder aprender sobre el uso de las criptomonedas que son Bitcoin, desde lo más mínimo hasta lo más elevado sobre aprender de uso de criptomonedas. Además, el gobierno del presidente Nayib Bukele lanzó una campaña comunicacional bastante fuerte para poder ayudar a la implementación de la Shibo Wallet, que es la herramienta de política pública que el presidente ha lanzado para poder acercar los medios digitales directamente relacionados con Shibo, con Bitcoin y con dólares a la población. Y eso resultó de que alrededor de 4 millones de salvadoreños pudieran descargar y usar la Chivo Wallet en los primeros 3 meses de implementación del Bitcoin como moneda de curso legal. Actualmente usted puede comprar en farmacias, en supermercados, en pequeños comercios y puede recibir remesas también. Cerca de 86 millones de remesas se han recibido desde septiembre del año pasado a marzo de este año. Y lo mejor de eso es que sin costo para la población. Tiene absolutamente cero costo, tanto recibir remesas, pagar, hacer el cash-in, hacer el cash-out, también tiene cero costo para la población. Eso para nosotros es sumamente importante. Estamos cerrando la brecha digital en el país, estamos cerrando y acercando los servicios financieros no tradicionales a aquellas personas excluidas de los servicios y productos financieros tradicionales en el país, que son alrededor del 77% del excluido. Cedo la palabra. Muchas gracias, Marilu.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been an extremely interesting and useful session. I will not attempt to summarize what each of our speakers did, but what you had was a comprehensive historical perspective of the development of crypto assets and digital currencies at a live country experience, which is evolving as we speak. And of course, the perspective of an international standard setter that's looking at how to mitigate risks to the systemic risks in the financial system. So very comprehensive set of viewpoints in a very short period of time. Now, let me now pass on what's evident is how complex it is, and the complexity will be even more evident in the next session. So let me turn to Alfred Hanig. Alfred, the floor is yours, and I'm sorry for the overrun in this session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm afraid that we will not be able to catch up because I think this is already very exciting discussion, and we are blessed to have a very knowledgeable panel this afternoon. So now, after having heard in the last session on the policy approaches being taken towards the private digital currencies, I think it's now time to turn our attention to the role that public digital currencies, those issued and overseen by the central banks, could play in respect of financial inclusion goals. And as we all have seen, the BIS, I think, survey has shown that financial inclusion has been a significant motivation for the development of the CBDCs, especially in the emerging markets and developing countries. Now, the promise is obviously that CBDCs designed with financial inclusion as a central goal can hold the potential to offer more efficient and resilient payments, enhance safety and trust in digital financial services, and also inclusion in digital financial services for all, especially for the ones that normally are left behind. Now, on the other hand, I think we also have learned so far that a certain level of digital access is critical, so that CBDCs do not have or cannot have unintended consequences, such as actually widening the digital divide. So what are the key policy and design questions central banks deploying CBDCs will have to carefully consider? And of course, we are in a flow of a discussion. This is not a one-off discussion. This discussion today builds on prior debates of CBDC's potential to impact financial inclusion in the AFI network and beyond. And notably, the high-level multi-stakeholders dialogue that we held in September 21 already initiated an exchange between AFI members, developed country regulators, the private sector, development partners on how to optimize the study and implementation of CBDCs for tangible financial inclusion outcomes. And since then, a lot of other research, practical implementation support has been taken forward. A range of organizations, including the IMF, BIS, World Bank, and Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, amongst others, have contributed quite a bit to this debate. Now, in a recent study, I think it's just, I think Mahesh shared it in the chat a couple of minutes ago, paper jointly produced by BIS and the World Bank Group concluded that let me quote, while CBDC is not a panacea, it can represent a further tool to promote financial inclusion if designed with this goal. End of quote. Now, with this in mind, I'm delighted really that during the session we will hear from regulators who have made financial inclusion a key objective at the heart of their CBDC designs. Firstly, we will hear from Governor Benjamin Diokno of the Banco Central Pilipinas, how CBDC could potentially contribute to the BSP's financial inclusion goals. Secondly, we will invite Governor Ernest Edison from the Bank of Ghana to share lessons from the Bank of Ghana CBDC pilot project, the e-CEDI. And we will then hear from Governor John Roll of the practical implementation experience of the Central Bank of the Bahamas, 18 months on from the first nationwide launch of CBDC, the sand dollar. But we will also hear a perspective from beyond, from Martin Sihak from the IMF, who has been deeply involved in the IMF's work today to support member countries in their CBDC projects. After this set, we hope that we have a few minutes to open the floor and also look forward to some of your questions. Now, let me start with Governor Diokno from the Central Bank of the Philippines. Governor, the BSP has rich experience in promoting financial inclusion as a key goal of the central bank. We have seen that for more than a decade and is actually recognized globally for this leadership in establishing an enabling regulatory environment for inclusive innovation to flourish. Now, what are the major remaining financial inclusion challenges that the Philippines faces? And how do you see the potential contribution of a CBDC towards your financial inclusion goals? Governor, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Alfred. Let me first thank and commend the organizers for setting a timely and highly interesting topic for this meeting. That is the risk and opportunities of digital currencies for financial inclusion. This subject touches on several major strategic objectives of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Digitalization of the payment system is one of the major goals of the BSP. Under the Digital Payments Transformation Roadmap, the BSP targets to digitalize half of total retail payments by next year. Faster processing of payments speeds up economic activities as well as capital turnaround and thus income growth. Inclusive finance is another major goal of the BSP in the Philippines. The BSP leads the implementation of initiatives under an interagency national strategy for financial inclusion, which aims for a coherent nationwide approach in accelerating financial inclusion in the country. The potential of digital finance and capabilities of digital technologies in achieving financial inclusion are deeply embedded in the NSFI. Ultimately, we aspire to transform the Philippines into a more technologically advanced, more inclusive, and more sustainable economy. Alongside this, the BSP takes a proactive stance in learning digital technologies that drive the emergence of alternative payment instruments. As more than 80 central banks worldwide are exploring central bank digital currencies or CBDCs, the BSP has also taken major steps in understanding CBDCs and knowing the benefits, the risk, as well as policy implications for issuing a Philippine CBDC. Now, allow me to briefly share what the BSP has done as far as regards to this initiative. The BSP initially conducted an exploratory study in 2020 to determine and evaluate the issues that surround CBDC issuance based on the literature and the learnings of other central banks. This study covered the prospective implications for the pillars of central banking in the Philippines, the legal aspects, as well as the potential of CBDCs in furthering financial inclusion. From this comprehensive study, we understood that a potential motivating factor for the BSP to explore CBDC issuance is to enhance the safety and efficiency of its existing national payment system. In 2021, we proceeded with identifying the use cases for CBDC issuance in the Philippines by comparing the functional features of the country's existing retail and large value payment systems with the use of CBDCs. Our goal was to identify the areas where a CBDC can yield the greatest value-adding benefit to the Philippine payment system. Based on this review, the BSP determined on the one hand that there is minimal value added on the use of retail CBDC in the Philippines in the short term, given the progress in our widespread implementation of retail payment, digitalization, and financial inclusion reforms. On the other hand, the BSP identified the value of a wholesale CBDC in addressing pain points in the national payment system in the following areas. First are the frictions of large cross-border foreign currency transfers. We believe that we need to address this issue by reducing transaction costs, shortening processing time, and enhancing the transparency of such transfers. Second is the settlement risk exposure arising from the use of commercial bank money in our equities market. And we intend to mitigate this risk with CBDC being a central bank money. Lastly, is the challenge of operating an intraday liquidity facility that we have yet to automate end-to-end. The CBDC may play a critical role in facilitating the settlement of intraday liquidity facility availments and the subsequent collection of the drawdown. Thereafter, in the light of the recommended use cases, we decided to pursue the implementation of a pilot wholesale CBDC under the initiative dubbed as Project CBDC PH. The main objectives of this project are as follows. First, we want to build the BSP's capacity so we can have hands-on knowledge on the functionality, the architecture, technology, operational, and organizational requirements of CBDC. And also we wish to leverage on the learnings from the pilot for pursuing further CBDC projects. The pilot project covers the experimentation of the CBDC's use to transfer large value financial transactions on a 24/7 basis across a limited number of financial institutions, but possibly covering both banks and non-bank institutions. The project CBDC is led by an intersectoral project management team in the BSP to ensure that we're able to cover the major critical elements in operating CBDC. And these areas include policy and regulatory considerations, technological infrastructure, governance and organizational requirements, legal matters, payments and settlement models, reconciliation procedures, and risk management. Equally important, the CBDC project team also includes external advisors from international standard-setting bodies and multilateral institutions to build on trainings and knowledge sharing on CBDC development and implementation globally. The pilot is a major step for both the BSP and the Philippine financial industry towards understanding the potentials and risk of a wholesale CBDC. The learnings from the pilot are critical in constructing the BSP's medium to long-term roadmap for more advanced wholesale CBDC projects that shall further strengthen the Philippine payment system. Finally, emerging digital technologies do not alter the mandates of central banks. Instead, emerging technologies facilitate the means for central banks to achieve their mandate of providing safe, efficient, and inclusive payment systems. At the core of these developments are capacity building activities and knowledge sharing sessions, such as this major event that help ensure that central banks are in pace and fully understand emerging digital technologies. For this reason, I thank you again, the organizers and participants, for this important event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor Diokno, for sharing the Philippine experience, and especially on the pilot, the experience that you have gone through and the systematic steps following through this process. I find your final remark, of course, quite important, that the mandates do not change. Perhaps they become even more complex, but obviously the role to play is very clear. And in order to understand better that role, we can now continue. And also, thank you very much, and listen to our next speaker. I just heard that perhaps Governor Addison had to step out. Robin, is that correct?
That appears to be correct, Alfred.
Okay, well, in this case, I propose that we then immediately move on to our next speaker, who I think would not need too much of an introduction. Governor John Roll, of the Governor of Central Bank of the Bahamas. Welcome, Governor. The Central Bank of the Bahamas activated its CBDC during 2020, as I said earlier, and as such has the most practical implementation experience of any jurisdiction to date. Now the question maybe the audience would be most interested in is how far has the rollout contributed to your financial inclusion objectives as a central bank? And what have been some of the key challenges that other members who would like to follow suit will need to be mindful of as they deploy their own retail CBDCs? Governor Roll, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Alfred, and a very pleasant and warm greetings to all of you colleagues in attendance. First of all, let me say that we're still very early on in the process of rollout of our CBDC, and we do not have the rich data yet around usage, which reflects the makeup of financial institutions that are involved in providing payment services. One of the interesting things for the Bahamas is that several things are happening at once as we introduce a CBDC. One is that we're beginning to introduce a population to mobile payments technology. And at the same time, we're seeing the entrance of new services providers who are developing products around mobile payments technology. Right now, there is, I think, a single firm that is active in the space. However, what this project has done is it has really sparked a lot of the imaginations around the FinTech applications and use. And to the extent that we've anticipated the importance at the retail level of an interoperable payment system, what we're seeing in the Bahamas is that the new technology platforms, once they go through the central bank's security assessment and screening, they are already anticipating the tie-in to the sand dollar, our central bank digital currency. And so now we're at the stage where it's important to begin that greater push for adoption, which will feed off the momentum that we have. As you mentioned, Alfred, it was in 2020 that we began to gradually release the sand dollar to nationally. What has, I think, made this process slower in getting out is the fact that, notwithstanding that it is a digital initiative, you need to have the interaction with the public, intimate interaction with the public, because you're introducing people to, in the Bahamas' case, more to the idea of going digital on the payments front, and therefore there's a certain level of public education and interaction, which the COVID-19 pandemic had not allowed us to be as fully engaged on. And so that is part of where we are in terms of the marketing push that's ahead of us. What we're seeing is that until we get multiple payment providers on the platform, the model that our providers are using often in terms of how they provide payment services, where they pool the funds that they're holding, means that even if funds are being exchanged on the platform, the settlement value that the CBDC provides, we're going to see that more readily as additional firms come on board and activate their platforms, and they will, in all of those cases, need to use the sand dollar for the net real-time settlement that's going to be happening across the platform. We've made a lot of progress, though, nevertheless, in terms of developing an electronic KYC platform, which is going to be integral for the kind of flexibility and portability that we want to see in the mobile wallet space, as well as the ease from a financial inclusion point of view of establishing relationships with financial institutions. When we talk about some of the elements that are ahead of us for adoption, and the lessons are very important, integration with the ACH is vital. In our pilot, that integration was not there. And so one of the first questions you would get from a potential business looking at it from a merchant services point of view is, well, how am I going to get my money if I accept this instrument? So it does not matter that we understand that it is good. Businesses are concerned about how quickly they can move it and satisfy any other transactional needs. And so from that point of view, we think a very important turning point for us is completing that integration with the ACH, so that that concern is instantly removed. We're also at this instant, because during the pilot, we did not have the engagement of our commercial banks. We are increasing that engagement, and we're increasing that engagement not at this point from a voluntary or optional point of view. The central bank is beginning to use its moral suasion to get the bank to think about how they can, from a rollout point of view, look at specific examples around use cases where they can become involved. For example, to the extent that we are an island nation and the fixed cost of providing banking services has led to some of the reduction in the physical network, we're expecting that the visibility of banks will come through in terms of how they demonstrate the use of these digital methods for the end point of the delivery of their services. And the end point of the delivery of services is still largely around the automated banking machines, the credit and debit card, but automated banking machines, particularly to the extent that there's still a significant amount of cash that is used in transactions. And so we do anticipate drawing the banks much more into this process. We're also, from a technology point of view, anticipating much more the autonomy that institutions need around managing the anti-money laundering requirements of providing payment services, as well as basic basic data insight tools that they need if they're operating on a CBDC platform. E-commerce is a need that we anticipate. And again, this is an example where in the Bahamian jurisdiction, the electronic commerce within country was not something that was very proliferate among our commercial sector. But we now realize that if we're going to promote that, we have to anticipate the secure back-end channels to which electronic transactions are concluded. And so we're building some of those, what we would call baseline specification into the CBDC platform. And I say baseline because there is still a balancing act between the importance of allowing FinTech innovations to thrive on the environment, but also to anticipate that there are what I would call some plain vanilla functionality that we have to deliver at the foundation of the system. And one of those we realize now is around the e-commerce needs. Now, and suddenly, notwithstanding the importance that we place on the private sector, we're starting to put on the hat of marketeers and thinking about the ways to push the adoption process. Jamaica, for example, would have mentioned recently that during the course of their pilots, they would be making some nominal transfers to early adopters. And I think we saw that case as well with the rollout of Bitcoin in our neighbors to the south. And to some extent, we saw that in the digital yuan aspect of their pilot. So we are looking in the Central Bank of Bahamas as well as to how we can incentivize more considerations around getting people on board and enjoying the experience. What we are very careful to focus on is, from the financial inclusion point of view, the hassle-free ability to open up a mobile wallet account. And for that, we have a US $500 lower limit. We call this a tier 1 for mobile wallets. And that is for anyone, whether they're a documented or undocumented person residing in the population, anyone, they should be able to download a mobile payment app and establish an account and transact. However, the enhanced and more entrenched customer due diligence standards that would typically apply if you're opening up a deposit account in the bank, etc., those tend to be invoked as individuals graduate to higher levels of holdings and transactions, whether they're businesses or persons. We've also, from a financial inclusion point of view, made it very clear that from a P2P basis, there should not be any transaction fees involved with the CBDC. I believe that some of the logistical structures around the way we've rolled out the sand dollar has required that we be more patient in the adoption process, because the central bank is not at the counter providing the retail services. The model is we mint the coin, maintain the ledger, and provide it through the wholesale channel to the financial institutions. They then do the legwork of connecting the public with the CBDC. That will probably, depending on the approach that you might take in your countries, is going to result at a different rate, I think, of how you can roll out your pilot or get into the early stages of adoption. But I think it at least it leans more on the medium to long term appropriate balance that's important from the point of view of the central banks focusing more on the core public goods aspects of this this innovation. And that is where we are in this process. And going forward, we recognize that the policy focus is going to continue to deepen, because we have to continue to deal with the data privacy and the consumer protection rights. But we're very excited in terms of what's ahead of us. And I do expect that we are going to begin to provide a lot more of those summary metrics that the outsiders are much interested in. But be mindful, a lot of lifting is still involved in getting the policy framework correct. And we're continuing to tweak that. Thank you, Alfred.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for this very, very relevant overview, particularly on the challenges. And I think your point on how to actually have a greater push for adoption, including private sector, including the public, but also commercial banks. I think that's an important point. And I think your final statement here on the policy focus that has to deepen in the future, I think is very, very similar to the final statement we got from Governor Diokno on the mandate of the central bank here. So I think with this, we already have a question in the chat for Governor Diokno, but let us continue and perhaps now listen to, thank you very much for the presentation, and let us now continue with Martin Siak from the IMF. Martin, the IMF, as we know, is very well placed to provide technical assistance. and other support to central banks as they study and as you study, and you also help, of course, in the design of the CBDCs. Now, the experience has taught us that interoperable payment systems can be a key bedrock for financial inclusion. But in this regard, what are the specific activities of the IMF in this area? And in particular, what role in the fund will the fund play to promote the interoperability of different CBDC solutions that are emerging? Martin, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfred. It's a great pleasure to join this distinguished panel. So I'll make 4 points. So first, I completely agree that CBDC is not a panacea. It's not the single perfect cure to financial inclusion. But when it's designed well, we find it can reduce barriers and lower costs. It needs to be a part of a broader legal, regulatory, and financial literacy efforts. And it can provide additional means of payments, for example, in remote areas, and it can close gaps, for example, between urban and rural. The key words here are when designed well. So policymakers need to understand the barriers to access and use. They need to consider factors such as demographics, geography, access to technology, literacy, and the broader financial services landscape. And as the governor has just mentioned, the broad acceptance and understanding of CBDCs is also essential. For example, in aging populations, what we find policymakers will need to work on messaging towards the elderly and be cognizant of the different degrees of digital and financial savvy across the population. So the key design features include privacy, programmability, resilience against risks such as fraud and cyber, access to hardware, offline functionality, and interoperability. Which brings me to my second point. You asked about interoperability and integration of CBDCs into payment system. And that indeed is a key design feature. Governor Roll has just provided some very good discussion from the Hamas. Yeah, the key issue really is the ability to integrate CBDCs with the existing systems so that there's smooth experience for the customers and the merchants accept the CBDC. It also should be interoperable with government services such as education, housing, and emergency services. So this interoperability can really improve and enable government-to-person payments and transfers through CBDCs. And maybe let me just say that the key point here is that the chosen design solution should be interoperable not only with the existing or legacy payment systems, but also with the potential or future payments networks. So it needs to have a built-in flexibility in itself. So my third point is about a different aspect of interoperability we haven't talked about yet, which is namely across the borders. So the Bahamas, as I understand it, is domestic for now. But there are important issues related to cross-border payments, and that's been much of our focus. Those rely on long payment chains, often across time zones, and central banks can really help by facilitating exchange of CBDCs and enhance interoperability by developing common standards, for example, for message formats and data. So we've done a survey of central banks considering CBDCs, and indeed this was flagged as an important hurdle in using CBDCs. So there's a lack of coordination on technology, and one of the building blocks of the G20 roadmap for enhancing cross-border payments is precisely aiming to factor an international dimension in the CBDC design. So the collaboration on the roadmap can help. There are also decentralized forms of compatibility between the different DLT systems, so that may also be promising. But there are broader issues beyond the technical interoperability. We also need to look at the legal and regulatory harmonization. So our survey suggests that we also need to harmonize, for example, the treatment of data, privacy, also tax and payment laws, and capital flow management measures. We have recently published a staff discussion note that proposes some principles for minimum global standards for data in the digital age. So these are quite complex issues, but they need to be tackled for CBDCs to be truly interoperable. And again, this is very important from the financial inclusion perspective, because cross-border payments have been criticized rightfully for high cost, slow speed, and limited access. Sending remittances across borders costs an average of 6.3% of the amount, which is well above the 3% objective set by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Given the total volume of remittances, which is about 700 billion per year, It means about $45 billion in remittances don't reach the hands of those people who need them. And sending remittances to the poorest countries is usually more expensive. So those that need the most are most effective. So I'm encouraged that many central banks are developing cross-border payments projects using digital money to test their efficiency and functionality. Examples include the project Dunbar of Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Africa. There's a project Jasper Ubin of Canada and Singapore, and the project Jura of France and Switzerland. More projects are in the works. So these, if implemented successfully, can really reduce the transaction times and payment costs, and this can have major effects for countries where remittance flows are important and countries with large unbanked populations. This link brings me finally to the role of the IMF. So the fund is trying to inform the policy debate through analysis. We put out a number of papers, for example, recent note on the experiences of 6 central banks implementing CBDCs. And we are trying to help countries through technical assistance or surveillance, Article 4s, and the FSAP program joined with the World Bank. We've done a survey of our members and found that the CBDCs are being considered by over 100 countries. About 83 are considering a retail CBDC, and about 20 are looking into a wholesale CBDC. Some are looking at both options. Only 2 are actually piloting or have completed the pilot for CBDC. Around 30 countries have requested IMF assistance on CBDCs just in the last year, and more are quickly coming on stream. And this is on top of countries already requiring assistance to modernize their financial market infrastructure, including their payment systems. Of course, Bahamas and Nigeria have already issued a CBDC, but most are still in the early stages of the process of CBDC adoption. So far, most of the requests of IMF assistance are focused on the exploration process, but we are seeing more countries now engaging on proof of concept. So the IMF advice focuses on the policy implications of CBDC. We always emphasize it's not just about solving technology problems, but also about getting the policies right. So the question is, what objective can CBDC help satisfy, and what are the alternatives? What data and capacity does the central bank need? What regulatory and legal frameworks are necessary? What effects might CBDCs have on the banking and financial sectors? And finally, what can CBDC, how it can be designed to help support the stability of the international monetary system? So we're going to do it alone, obviously. We work closely with partners, including country authorities, the World Bank, BIS, FSB, and other standard setters. And of course, we really appreciate these interactions with the AFI and the G-24. So let me stop here. Happy to answer questions. Back to you, Alfred.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you also for highlighting the need for coordination on the cross-border payments and the international, actually emphasizing international dimension, which I think is certainly something that we have also put forward at many instances in the network. This international exchange is super important, and we, of course, would be happy to assist further. Now, coming to the first question here, and I think that links nicely to your point on the cross-border payments, that goes to Governor Diokno from the Central Bank of the Philippines. And the question is around overseas remittances that are key pillars of the Philippine economy, as we all know. Now, is the Philippine Central Bank looking into remittances as a potential area for CBDC, since the technology has the potential to significantly cut costs involved in cross-border payments? That's the question, Governor.
Definitely. I think that's the advantage of an interoperable CBDC across. And we're talking with, of course, there are BIS studies in Singapore and Hong Kong, and so we have the observer status, and we are also coordinating with Singapore and Indonesia on this. So we are looking at this as an advantageous to our overseas Filipino workers.
Okay, thank you very much, Governor. Are there any other questions from the audience? I don't see anything in the chat. or any hands? Okay. Well, then let me perhaps, Governor Roll, if you allow me to add one question on the push that you actually to involve various stakeholders. And you mentioned, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic as one of the challenges here, actually, to have such a greater push for adoption. But now with the actual situation easing and the conditions going slowly but surely back to what we see maybe more as a normality, my question to you would be, do you see still the same enthusiasm around the CBDC in the Bahamas? I mean, we have heard about the challenges, we have heard about the complexity of the issues, and what kind of outreach are you planning in the future, in addition to what you have been doing, in order actually to engage with all these stakeholders to actually increase the momentum around the sand dollar?
Well, certainly the interest is still there, and I think to our detriment, I think the international attention that we get has also sparked added curiosity domestically. So for us, it really is a priority for the population to begin to feel the CBDC. What we know that we have to focus on is ensuring that the businesses are plugged in. And so a very important part of our adoption push is to have a centralized way of businesses raising their hands and being able to establish merchant relationships with the payment providers. We also have to manage our capacity around doing a sequential introduction of ourselves throughout the individual islands of the Bahamas. So that is very important. Some of the momentum slowed, and we know that it has to restart because we went through a change in political administration around the third and fourth quarter of last year. But the political support is still very strong. And so we know we need to have a very strong bond with the government, because the government has to be one of those pioneers around the adoption process. And frankly, the pressure is increasing on the government around digital inclusion, because the government is also trying to go more electronic, even in some cases around payment. And so now they need to demonstrate that all citizens have a channel for making digital payments. So the timing is there, but we're also having to balance our own internal capacity, because some of what we're doing is really a project, and eventually the financial system has to resource and operate. So we're trying to maintain that balance as well in terms of pacing, and not promising ahead of how much we can deliver and respond to the population.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Well, before we wind up this session, perhaps one quick question to you, Martin, follow up. And this is really connecting us also to the first session. So my question would be now, against the background that the interest in the digital currencies obviously continues to expand, and you have given us also the numbers about more than 80 countries you mentioned that have shown interest in this. Do you envisage a competition or a coexistence between private and public central bank digital currencies in the future? Where do you see the trends going there?
I think at a very high level, I think we see that there's going to be a coexistence. I think for the CBDCs, we've been emphasizing interoperability and integration, and for the other parts of digital money, the issues of regulation, comprehensive, consistent, and complete set of regulations. So I think that we, looking historically at the evolution of money, you always have a combination of state issued and private issued money in the current context. And perhaps in some advanced economies, we've seen a movement towards more private money. In some, Northern European countries, cash has almost disappeared. So this reintroduction of CBDC, I think, in some ways can help sort of reestablish some degree of control for the policymaker. But we don't see this sort of a dramatic change in the sort of composition of private versus public money in the economy, right? So I think you always, even in a central bank issued digital money, you still have a big component that will be private. And I think all these projects that I was describing very much sort of envisage this two-tiered approach, where there's an important role for the other providers. So I think it's a very important point that certainly I think one of the considerations for policymakers is to maintain some degree of control over monetary policy and other policies, capital flow measures. But I don't see the CBDCs as a sort of major new trend, in the sense that there'll be sort of a shift towards more public sector money. Let me stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I think we can now move forward, and also in the interest of time, finally perhaps come to the close of this session. But let me just say that we really appreciate this discussion. It is very clear that we are dealing with a highly complex topic that raises significant new issues for central bankers and financial regulators to contend with. And I think, Rupert, you said it very well when you actually talked about the crypto assets. It's actually not so clear what standards should be applied. So I think it is a very complex debate, and obviously it will keep us very busy along the way. On the other hand, it is already clear that CBDCs will be part of the future of the financial system design, and it is timely now to ensure that financial inclusion is embedded in the design and the thinking and the early experimentation in this area. This will require not merely tweaking existing regulations, but also reassessing from first principles the appropriate policy frameworks that are needed to cope with risks and opportunities arising from the ongoing digital transformation of financial services. We do learn again from this session, I think, that central banks deploying CBDCs need to carefully consider a number of key policy and design questions, including balance of privacy and financial integrity, role of private sector and implementation, and mitigating the risk of disintermediating the banking sector. There is a significant range of experiences and approaches between jurisdictions already available. Hence, as we heard, we are not yet at the point of a common standard. In this regard, continued peer learning, public-private dialogue, and efforts like this one towards global coordination, convergence around challenges, but also solutions, will be vital to promote payments interoperability at a global level and to avoid regulatory fragmentation. I think the point was also made by Martin on the necessity of the to see this international dimension. Within the AFI network, we are committed to playing a role to support continued policy dialogue, research or capacity development. There are manifold activities you're all aware of, including the forthcoming special report on CBDCs and financial inclusion, which has been led by the AFI Financial Services, Digital Financial Services Working Group. We will also take a use case approach to evaluating the potential benefits for CBDCs for inclusion, and of course, hopefully can also carry forward the strategic dialogue on building inclusive design into policy and technology choices together with all our partners. Well, thank you very much once again to all participants for joining today's important discussion. It is now not only my pleasure to really thank especially the panelists again for their valuable contributions, but also now hand back to Marilu before we hear the closing remarks from the Central Bank of Guatemala as a chair of the G24. Thank you very much. Marilu, back to you.
Thanks very much, Alfred. Like Alfred, we at the G24 is very committed to doing more knowledge sharing platforms or forums, just because this is a rapidly evolving area, but also that there is a lot of learning over as experience deepens, across countries. So we will continue putting, let's say, events together and discussion spaces so that developing countries can interact among themselves, but also interact with, let's say, international financial regulators or standard setters, as well as, of course, the IMF and the World Bank. So with that, let me give the floor, and it is my great pleasure to call on Oscar Monterroso, General Manager, Central Bank of Guatemala, and Guatemala is our chair of the G24 this year. So Oscar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marilu. Distinguished colleagues, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Governor Sergio Recinos, Governor of the Central Bank of Guatemala, and Chair of the G24, it's an honor to give the closing remarks to today's G24 AFI Roundtable on digital currency. Let me start by celebrating the G24 long-standing partnership with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Over the years, we have facilitated knowledge sharing among policymakers on key areas to advance financial inclusion in developing countries. Today's discussion highlighted the sweeping growth of digital assets in the financial sector and the surge of interest in development of CBDCs. More than 80% of central banks around the world are in various stages of investigating design and implementation issues of CBDCs in their jurisdiction. This is a major focus of innovation in the financial sector. We share many of the views expressed on the benefits of digital money on promoting financial inclusion, increasing efficiency in the use of financial services and products that transcends of the real sector, improving national and cross-border payments system, and enhancing transparency in payments. Our discussion is especially timely for Guatemala. In the second quarter of 2021, the central bank formed a task force for the investigation phase of developing a CBDC. The task force will provide feedback on the viability of the introducing a CBDC, the e-Quetzal, and the convenience of its implementation in Guatemala. It has therefore been very useful for us to listen to our speakers today about the policy and regulatory approaches, as well as country experiences in developing CBDCs. The potential benefits of digital payments are in line with Guatemala's National Strategy for Financial Inclusion 2019-2023, whose main objective is to increase the access and use of quality financial products and services that meet the needs of the population, especially of those currently excluded. We are keen on making cross-border payments for much efficient. Note that remittances account for 15% of our GDP, 15 million in 2020. CBDCs would allow for simplified, safe, and more direct cross-border transaction between different types of currency, which in turn could improve financial inclusion. Currently, 44% of Guatemala's population has a bank account, with 33% having made or received digital payment in the last year. In addition, Most of our small and medium enterprises have account with a formal financial institution. These numbers have nearly doubled in the last decade, and we clearly see opportunities to further advance financial inclusion. We are working to transform transactional clients and remittances recipients into bank account holders, pulling them out of the informal sector and into the financial system. In the agricultural sector, for example, our global food security strategy aims to increase smallholders farmers' access to a variety of financial services, including digital financial services. Furthermore, crypto assets introduced by the private sector have garnered some traction in Guatemala. However, rapid growth of crypto assets without appropriate regulation or surveillance pose significant risk to financial stability to users and to consumers. Thus, we are working to approaches to regulate crypto assets. Clearly, we are still at the early stage of research on digital currency can safely and effectively boost financial inclusion. On CBDCs, the research that we have done so far at the central bank has led to initial reflection and conclusion that will serve as a starting point to assess the eventual issuance of CBDC in the future. There is much more that needs to be done, and it's essential to take the necessary time to increase our knowledge of this new and rapidly evolving area. To quote Mr. Jeremy Powell of the US Federal Reserve, it's better to get it right than to get it quickly. Let me end here, colleagues. Thank you to all of you for your active participation today. I look forward to seeing you in the future G-24 AFI Roundtables.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much also for sharing the experience of Guatemala in this session. So we are now at the end of our roundtable and discussion, and I would like to thank our excellent speakers for joining us today and giving us the time to discuss this fascinating subject. I hope that we can draw more of your expertise in the times ahead as this area expands and deepens, and as Alfred said, will be a focal point of a major focus of the financial system globally. So I would like to thank Alfred for his long-standing partnership, and the team in AFI, as well as the G-24 who have made this event possible. Thanks a lot for all your assistance. So, and to all of you who have joined us today, I hope that we will see you in our future AFI G-24 roundtables. So with that, I bid you goodbye and keep safe. Thank you very much.